I'm delighted to say that today we're joined by Steve Bradshaw. Steve is a part-time clinical commissioner for the Neighbourhood, for the neighbourhoods, working for Stockport Clinical Commissioning Group. Although Stephen is now retired as a consultant psychiatrist, he's obviously got a very much his hands in, and his experience is greatly appreciated, especially as we start to move out of the pandemic. And one of the things we want to talk about today is how Stephen would advise people to look after their mental health as they start to return to the office. Steve, if I can just ask you first, just tell us a little bit about your background and what you've been doing over the past 15 months.
Yeah, thanks. So I qualified as a doctor in 1984 and then worked in mental health from 1987. And that was full-time until I retired in 2015 and then came back part-time into this current job. So it's been, very much a part of my working life for now on 40 years. Over the last 15 months or so, then, like everyone else, the COVID affects everybody. It hasn't affected me in the sense of being a frontline worker anymore. So I'm not working in Stepping Hill Hospital or something like that. It's been working from home. And so in that sense, it's been like sharing the experience of a lot of people working in offices and kind of management. And the other thing is that as far as well-being and resilience and this sort of area goes, it's something I've had a particular interest in for about the last 20 years, 25 years or so. I first gave a talk about it about 25 years ago when it was a very new term, well-being. It was a new invention almost, and I've retained interest ever since then. I just think it's so important, and from my point of view as well, some of the stuff that comes out in social media, in particular, very often it just gives a little part of the picture. And so what I was hoping today would be just to give a better view of what well-being entails for all of us, which is a more balanced view, because it is all about balance. So it's not just about running around in circles or meditating or whatever. It's being able to maintain our physical, our mental, and our social well-being. And that's actually what the World Health Organization definition is. So it talks about all three pillars being just as important: our mental, our social, and our physical well-being. And it also points out it's not just an absence of illness or infirmity, it's more than that. So this is for people who would generally view themselves as being well. And I think one of the challenges in this last 14 months, when in particular, if we go early doors, when we were only allowed out for an hour, was how to spend that. What would that mean in terms of keeping our kind of body together? How dangerous actually was it, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, all those questions, fortunately, are kind of more or less behind us. But nonetheless, I think going forward, there's an opportunity for all of us to consider our well-being and take action, if necessary, in order to try to maintain a better sense of balance going forward.
One of the things that I've seen many people experience over the last 14 months since March in 2020 is that they've actually had time to reflect on themselves, and they've had time to have a look and see what the benefits have been over the last 14 months. What have they learned? Now, a lot of people haven't been able to adopt that mindset, but having said, there are an awful lot of people who have, and I'm hoping that people will still continue to do things like take physical exercise, because certainly in the first few months of lockdown, we saw an awful lot of more people who were out as families. They were out walking and just giving that little bit more attention to themselves. How important do you think that is that we continue with that?
It's absolutely crucial. And I mean, when I was working up until 2015, I was just like any other bloke. I wasn't paying attention to it in the way that I should have been doing. And it's only really that privileged position of working part-time that enabled me to be considering this pre-pandemic. But I think that the rest of us have now had this golden opportunity. And the reason why it really interests me is, personally, is that it's kind of marketed now and in the news as something new. There's nothing remotely new about people considering well-being and what that means. It's been with us for over 2,000 years. And I, even when I was a young lad going on holidays, I was always particularly interested in the way that the ancient civilizations dealt with it. And I think their model translates into the present day absolutely beautifully. And if you like, I can just talk about that for a minute, because hopefully that will make some sense. So in ancient Greece, they were the people that everybody knows, Hippocrates, father of medicine, blah, 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 blah. And what they did was they had places of healing, and their view of healing was to try to balance people in what they called in those days, the humours. Well, we know that the physiology behind the humours is nonsense, but the actual philosophy of it makes a lot of sense. So for them to be in a place of healing, what was necessary was to have a place of shelter. Obviously, that's a given. To have spring water, and even that's interesting, because nowadays we're always talking about drink more water, cut back on booze, have plenty of fluids, keep hydrated. So even that basic necessity from 2,500 years ago resonates today. And you'd also have a place to sleep. Well, when you read and see any of the stuff about well-being, what you'll notice is there's a lot of attention about sleep. Sleep pattern is absolutely crucial. And many of us have found that difficult in the last 12 or 14 months. We've kept different hours. Because we've perhaps been working online, it's more difficult to box up work so that it's just during the daytime, or it's during the shifts that when we work, or whenever it's meant to be able to switch off from it, go to bed at a sensible time. Just as importantly, in my view, get up at a sensible time. Just keep that rhythm going. And that's extremely important for performance during the daytime. So the spring water, the sleep, and then the big things that they emphasized, and every healing place had these three things in them, was a temple, a theatre, and a gymnasium. So if you go on holiday to Greece or to the Greek islands and you go to these ruins, what you usually find is one or two of them have been excavated. So you can go to Delphi and you can see the temple, you can go to Epidaurus and you can see the theatre, you can go behind the temple at Delphi, there's a gymnasium, for example. But all these places had a temple, a gym, and a theatre. And this is the key to the well-being, which translates, in my opinion, to nowadays. Because obviously a temple is where you go for your spiritual well-being, a theatre is where you go to feed your soul, and a gym is where you go to feed your body. And so for me, that just links kind of almost word perfect with the World Health Organization definition of well-being 2,500 years later. And the challenge for all of us is actually to feed all three streams. And the most difficult thing usually is to actually think about the bit that's missing. So for example, if you're a bit of a fitness bunny, then you may well be looking after your body, you may well be in good shape, but are you actually doing the hard graft of considering what you do to feed your soul or your spirit? If you're somebody who, let's say, is quite religious and gets a lot of support through the local church or mosque or whatever, then it could be that you're not looking at your physical health, and that's where you need to place your attention. And I think that's the challenge, and that's the thing that doesn't seem to come out very much in the modern world in things like social media, because it's driven, and we tend to get kind of through the algorithms, etc. We get more of the same rather than what we really need, which is something different.
So it's mind, body, and soul, isn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So if you think about, what can you do nowadays to feed your mind? Well, some of us are lucky. So if you've got a very interesting job, for example, then generally speaking, the bit that it makes it interesting is the kind of, if you like, the intellectual challenge, or making stuff and coming up with ideas and all that lot. So we might actually be feeding our mind. But even there, what you have to consider is, well, what would be a nice contrast to that, just to give it a roundedness. And these days, obviously, we don't all go off to some posh ancient Greek theatre, but we can choose what we watch on the telly. We can make a deliberate decision. I want to watch something which is funny. I want to watch something which has got a bit of plot. I want to watch something which is beautiful. And we can actually make that choice as a real thought through choice, which will complement how we feel. If we've had a rough day and we're fed up, why would we choose to watch a programme on the telly which was miserable and about how bad the world was?
Mm-hmm.
Hey, maybe we would want to watch that programme because it's written very well or acted very well or whatever, but why don't we do that on the day when we've had a good day at work? So it's about actually taking hold of the way that we run our lives, using all this choice which is given us nowadays, but using it in a kind of creative way, which is personalised and gives us a sense of balance in whatever's missing. So for feeding our soul, we can read books, we can look at, watch films on the telly, cinemas are reopening, no doubt the theatres and concerts, etc. are going to get going as crowds come in. And all I'm urging folk is to actually consider the content of what they choose to do. Does it complement? Is it a contrast? Is it thought through?
How important do you think it is for employers, as people do return to the workspace, to change their attitude maybe? Because I think people, as I say, have been at home, they have been working. I think a lot of employers have been quite surprised at how successful that's been, because people have been disciplined enough to be able to get on with their work and perhaps enjoy a better life-work balance, because they've been able to go and put the washing out before they sit at the desk because they've got time to do it. They've got an extra hour or 2 hours a day of less travelling time. But what do you think people's fears about going back into the workplace might be, and how would you advise them to deal with that?
Yeah, it's a massive subject, isn't it? And certainly in the world where I work, so in the CCG and health and social care, aside from the people who are frontline through necessity, everyone else has found that performance has been much better than expected in remote working. And obviously that's gone hand in hand with the technology. So I think the vast majority of businesses will be asking themselves the same question about whether they want to go back to a kind of previous state, whether they want to completely abandon that, or whether they want to have some kind of mishmash of part home and part work. As with most things, it's very much a very personal thing. And I think for businesses, the thing to consider is that the working day starts from when the person leaves the house. And so for some people, for example, going under public transport, that might actually be the biggest issue of a return to work. So the person may have confidence about the workplace itself, but they may feel very concerned about getting on a bus or a train. So I think the flexibility and the concern from the kind of managerial side or the human resources side or whatever business needs to take into account the personal context of that individual's workday experience. So having assumed that the person actually has got back into work, then the other thing is that flexibility about recognizing that it's quite a difficult thing to predict how we're going to respond. So I think there'll be, the majority of people will be fine, but there'll be the few people who have felt that they were going to be really anxious and nervous about it, but do better than they thought they would. And then there'll be the people who actually get almost ambushed because they've not really thought it through. They've just assumed it would be fine. And then when they've actually turned up at the workplace, been surprised that they feel anxious and nervous. So I think the open, having a culture where people are able to voice how they're genuinely feeling without fear that there's going to be some kind of retribution or whatever, is extremely important. And that kind of goes in hand with the kind of flexibility, so that there's a knowledge and an expectation that it will take a little while before people get reused to being in the work environment, bobbing along with colleagues who they may not have seen for the last 12 or 14 months. There may have been changes in personnel, so newbies coming in would need to be looked after particularly so that they feel engaged and part of the team. And likewise, the people who have found working at home especially convenient, they may need some degree of accommodation in terms of going back to how things were. So, for example, if you've got kids or caring duties, you may have found a new way of doing that, and there may be changes, for example, in the availability of the supporting folk who helped you with your own family situation. And I think the moral of the tale will continually be flexibility and the recognition that it might take some of the members of staff a little longer to settle back in.
I think that's very, very sound advice. It was a lot of people have actually bought pets, haven't they, for comfort over the last 14 months or so. So it'll be interesting to see how employers handle that when people have been able to let the dogs out, take the dogs out for a walk, etc., etc. So yeah, I think hopefully what will come out of all this is that people do actually end up with a better life, more of a blended work and personal home experience, which I think would probably benefit everybody. So I think that we've just about covered everything, because I was going to ask you what the foundations are for well-being, body, mind and spirit, but I think you've kind of covered that off. Yeah. Unless there's anything else that you want to add, Steve.
Well, if we go back to that bit, I spoke about how we feed our souls, and also a little bit about how we feed our bodies, but I didn't touch on how we feed our spirit. So I'll just say a little bit more about the body bit first and then the spirit. The thing about physical health is, I think it's all right for somebody like myself. You know, I all my life I've actually done quite a lot of sport. So I used to play football, I used to play rugby. I do a lot of physical activities. It's sort of easy, but supposing you're not somebody who enjoys that kind of thing, how can you try to keep your body in reasonable shape? And I think, again, this is about how you can think out the box a bit. For example, people who sing or play musical instruments, those are physical activities. Singing is very, very good for breathing control, for vital capacity. That helps people's cardiovascular state. So you don't have to be breaking sweat and doing loads and loads of energetic activity to actually help your body. And what I would encourage people is just to have that, just to think as to what sorts of activities they really like, and see how that helps them physically, because it will. So that was the only thing, the remaining thing I wanted to point out about physical self-care, if you like. I'm not going to harp on about all the stuff that everybody knows, other than it is important. So COVID, more than anything, showed how important weight is, and also the other kind of evils of the day, you know, so the smoking and drinking and all that. But we all know that, and I think the only thing I would urge people is to try to have an honest conversation with themselves about those sorts of habits, to try to do something about it, even if you've struggled in the past. It's always worth doing. The spirit is a more difficult thing, because up until recently in this country, most people found spiritual support and guidance through a very kind of ritualized, if you like, Christian way of doctrine. And obviously that is still the case for some people, and we're now much more multicultural and we're much more secular. To me, it's really interesting that the last 25, 30 years has been a lot of interest, in particular in Eastern philosophy, whether that's relatively pure in things like yoga and meditation, or whether it's a hybrid with cognitive therapy and something like mindfulness, which is basically a mixture of Eastern philosophy combined with some Western ideas. My view is that if you're not an especially religious person, the most likely place that you're going to find a spiritual satisfaction that will contribute to your well-being is looking at areas like mindfulness, yoga, and breathing exercises, using scent, you know, a relaxing bath with a candle. All those sorts of activities essentially have got a spiritual side to them, and they can be a big contributor to the overall well-being of an individual. I
think that's been great, Steve, by the way. And you just brought me to mind there, is that we've said for a long time that work is something I do, not where I go, and spiritual well-being is something I practice, not where I go to. So it's very similar, isn't it?
It's very, very similar. And actually, the funny thing is, Helen, I think if you've got like a personal mantra like that, little one-liners, they often help keep us grounded and keep us revisiting these sort of principles, because the more simple it is, the better. And that's why, as you mentioned yourself earlier on, you just hold that mantra up in your mind's eye. What am I doing for my body? What am I doing for my spirit? What am I doing for my soul? And you look at how you're passing your time, you won't be far short of achieving the aims of well-being.
So good advice is maybe to address one of those, maybe just for 5 minutes each day, but just be kind to yourself and address each of those in time. Yeah.
Exactly. And although I said it earlier on, I mean it, but I don't mean it in any kind of nasty way. The difficult thing is to address the bit that's missing. And there's generally something missing in all of us, you know, none of us are perfect. So there's bound to be bits that we don't do so well. But it's often best to try and spend 5 or 10 minutes considering the bit that we don't do so well, because the dividend of doing that better will always have a greater effect than just doing something you already do well better.